emergency room nurse became suspicious when a stepfather brought in a 7-year-old with unusual injuries. When she created a distraction and asked the boy what really happened, his whisper made her blood run cold. The ambulance bay doors of Mercy General Hospital's emergency department slid open with a mechanical hum, releasing a blast of crisp October air into the corridor. Elaine Winters barely noticed. After 15 years as an ER nurse, the constant flux of temperature, noise, and human drama had become as familiar as her own breathing. The evening had brought the usual parade of Boston's emergencies. A construction worker with a nail through his palm, an elderly woman with pneumonia, a college student with alcohol poisoning, all typical for a Thursday night shift. Elaine tucked a strand of her auburn hair back into her practical bun as she updated patient charts at the nurse's station. At 42, the fine lines around her eyes had deepened, partly from age but mostly from years of expressions of concern, concentration, and occasionally heartbreak. She glanced at the wall clock. 8:47 p.m. The night was young in emergency room terms. Elaine, we've got a pediatric intake in Bay 3. 7-year-old male, reported fall from bicycle. Called Nancy, the triage nurse, sliding a preliminary chart across the counter. Elaine nodded, taking the chart. Pediatric cases always triggered a particular alertness in her. Children couldn't always articulate their pain or their stories with the precision of adults. They required a different kind of reading, one that went beyond vital signs and medical histories. Bay 3's curtain was partially drawn. Elaine pulled it open to find a small boy sitting on the examination table, shoulders hunched, gaze fixed on the tiled floor. Beside him stood a man in his mid-30s, well-dressed in a navy blazer and khakis, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder in what might have appeared to be a gesture of comfort. "Hello there. I'm Nurse Winters," Elaine said, directing her words primarily to the child before acknowledging the man with a professional nod. "And you must be Tommy." The boy, Tommy, lifted his eyes briefly, revealing a startling blue that contrasted with his pallid complexion, then returned his gaze to the floor. He didn't speak. "Yes, this is Tommy Mills. I'm Richard Blackwood, his stepfather," the man interjected, extending his free hand. His grip was firm, his smile practiced, the kind that business professionals perfect for meetings. "Thank goodness you can see us." He took quite a tumble from his new bike. Elaine smiled warmly at Tommy, setting the chart down. "Mind if I take a look at where you're hurt?" she asked, keeping her voice gentle. Tommy shrugged, a barely perceptible movement. "He's a bit shy," Richard explained, his tone carrying a note of apology tinged with something else. Impatience, perhaps. "The main injury is his wrist. He landed on it pretty hard when he fell over the handlebars. But he's got some scrapes too on his back and arms. Boys and their adventures, right?" Elaine maintained her professional demeanor, but something in Richard's explanation raised a quiet flag in her mind. She'd heard countless injury stories over the years, and there was an over-rehearsed quality to his account that felt discordant. "When did this happen, Tommy?" she asked, directing the question to the boy as she gently examined his swollen left wrist. Before Tommy could answer, Richard cut in. "Just this afternoon, around 4. I was at work and he was riding in the driveway. My wife Jessica usually watches him, but she's on a night shift at the Harborview Hotel. Tommy called me. Smart boy knew to use his mom's cell, and I came right home and brought him here." Elaine nodded, noting how Richard answered for the child. She also noted Tommy's slight flinch when his stepfather mentioned his mother. "Tommy, I'm going to need to check your other injuries too. Would you mind taking off your shirt so I can see your back?" Elaine asked, maintaining eye contact with the boy. Tommy looked up at Richard, seeking permission or perhaps gauging reaction. Richard nodded, but Elaine caught a flicker of something. Hesitation, tension. Cross his face before he rearranged his features into concerned encouragement. "Go ahead, sport. The nurse needs to check everything out." Tommy slowly removed his long-sleeved t-shirt, revealing a torso that was too thin for a 7-year-old. But it was the bruising that immediately caught Elaine's attention. Yellow-green marks along his ribcage that were at least several days old, not fresh from a bike accident that allegedly happened hours ago. On his upper arms were circular marks that Elaine recognized with a sinking feeling. They resembled cigarette burns in various stages of healing. Elaine kept her expression neutral while her mental alarm bells rang louder. The pattern of injuries was inconsistent with a simple fall from a bicycle. The wrist injury itself appeared to be a Cole's fracture, common in falls, but the discoloration suggested it was older than claimed, perhaps 2 or 3 days old rather than hours. These bruises look like they might be from earlier accidents, Elaine commented, her tone conversational as she made notes on the chart. Has Tommy had other falls recently? Richard shifted his weight, his hand moving to rest on Tommy's shoulder again, in what now seemed to Elaine like a restraining gesture rather than a comforting one. He's an active kid, Richard replied smoothly, always climbing trees, jumping off things. Last week he fell off the swing set. I keep telling Jessica we need to keep a closer eye on him, but you know how boys are. Fearless. Tommy remained silent, but Elaine noticed his fingers gripping the edge of the examination table, knuckles white. Tommy, does your wrist hurt a lot? Elaine asked, carefully palpating around the swollen area. Tommy nodded, still not speaking. He hasn't complained much, Richard interjected. Tough little guy. I think we'll need some x-rays, Elaine said. And Dr. Cooper will want to examine him as well. She turned to Tommy with a warm smile. You're being very brave. Do you think you could answer some questions for me while we wait for the doctor? We've already been here for over an hour, Richard said, checking his expensive watch with a frown. Is the x-ray really necessary? I mean, it's clearly sprained. Maybe just a brace would do. We need to rule out a fracture, Elaine explained, noting Richard's resistance. If it's broken and not properly set, it could heal incorrectly. Richard sighed, acquiescing with visible reluctance. Fine, but let's try to speed things up. I've got early meetings tomorrow. I'll do my best, Elaine assured him, then turned back to Tommy. Tommy, are you in school yet? Tommy nodded. What grade are you in? Second, he whispered. His voice so soft Elaine had to lean in to hear him. And do you like school? A shrug. His teacher says he's very bright, Richard cut in. But sometimes he doesn't apply himself. We're working on that, aren't we, Tommy? Tommy nodded, but the movement seemed mechanical. Elaine continued her examination, noting more inconsistencies. There were no abrasions on the palms, which would be expected if he'd tried to break a fall. The scrapes on his back were in places unlikely to be injured in a bike accident. Most concerning was a handprint-shaped bruise partially visible on his upper arm, emerging from beneath his sleeve. I'm going to check your vital signs now, Tommy, Elaine said, wrapping a blood pressure cuff around his small arm. As she leaned in, she whispered very quietly, You're safe here, Tommy. His eyes darted to hers, a flicker of something, hope, perhaps, before they clouded again with fear. Elaine recorded his blood pressure and pulse, both elevated, which could be attributed to pain but also to stress. She needed to create an opportunity to speak with Tommy alone, but Richard's hovering presence made this challenging. Mr. Blackwood, we'll need to complete some additional paperwork since this is Tommy's first visit to our ER, Elaine fabricated smoothly. Would you mind stepping over to the registration desk? Nancy will help you with the forms. I'll stay with Tommy while we wait for Dr. Cooper. Richard hesitated, then nodded. Sure, of course. He turned to Tommy, his voice dropping to a register that contained a subtle warning. Be good for the nurse, Tommy. I'll be right back. As Richard stepped out, Elaine noticed Tommy's shoulders drop slightly, as if relieved of an invisible weight. She busied herself preparing for the doctor's examination, giving Tommy a moment to adjust to his stepfather's absence. Tommy, she said gently, positioning herself so she could see if Richard returned. Did you really fall off your bike today? Tommy stared at his lap, unmoving. It's okay if you did, Elaine continued softly. But if something else happened, you can tell me. My job is to help kids feel better. And sometimes that means finding out what really made them hurt. Tommy glanced toward the curtain, checking for Richard. He's still doing paperwork, Elaine assured him. It's just you and me right now. After a long moment, Tommy raised his eyes to meet hers. They were filled with a weariness no 7-year-old should possess. "I don't have a bike," he whispered, the words barely audible. Elaine felt her heart constrict. "Can you tell me what happened to your wrist, Tommy?" Tommy swallowed hard. He got mad. "Because I spilled juice on his computer papers." "Your stepfather?" "Richard." A tiny nod. "And your back?" "The marks on your back and arms." Tommy's eyes welled with tears. "Different times. When I'm bad." His voice trembled. "Please don't tell him I told you," he said. He broke off, a tear sliding down his pale cheek. "What did he say, Tommy?" Elaine prompted gently, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the cold anger building inside her. "He said he'd hurt Mom if I told. He locks me in the basement when I'm bad. Sometimes for days." Tommy's voice cracked. "Please don't tell him I told you." Elaine heard footsteps approaching and quickly squeezed Tommy's hand. "You're very brave for telling me, Tommy. I won't let him hurt you again." Dr. James Cooper, a veteran emergency physician with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, entered just as Richard returned. Elaine gave the doctor a meaningful look that communicated the need to speak privately. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm Dr. Cooper. Let's take a look at our young patient here," he said, shaking Richard's hand before turning his attention to Tommy. "Hello, Tommy. Nurse Winters tells me you've had an accident." While Dr. Cooper began his examination, Elaine excused herself, ostensibly to arrange the X-ray. Once outside the curtain, she moved quickly to the nurse's station, where she placed a call to Mia Patel, the hospital's social worker on duty. Years of dealing with suspected abuse cases had taught her the protocols well. "Mia, it's Elaine in the ER. I need you for a suspected child abuse case in Bay 3. 7-year-old male, multiple suspicious injuries inconsistent with the reported cause, and he's just disclosed physical abuse by his stepfather who's present." "I'll be right down," Mia replied. "Have you documented everything?" "Working on it now. Also need to check if there's a history of ER visits for this child. Name is Tommy Mills, 7 years old. On it. I'll contact Child Protective Services and alert security to stand by discreetly." "Thanks, Mia. The stepfather is becoming agitated about the time we're taking. We may need to manage him carefully." Elaine ended the call and quickly updated Tommy's chart with his disclosure, adding detailed notes about the pattern and aging of his injuries. She attached the photos she'd taken during her examination, making sure they clearly showed the discrepancy between the claimed mechanism of injury and the actual presentation. When she returned to Bay 3, Dr. Cooper was completing his examination. Like Elaine, he'd recognized the signs of potential abuse and was maintaining a professional demeanor while gathering more evidence. "We'll definitely need that X-ray," Dr. Cooper said, making eye contact with Elaine. "And I'd like to do a few additional tests just to be thorough." Richard shifted impatiently. "Is all this really necessary? We've already been here for nearly 2 hours. Standard protocol for pediatric injuries," Dr. Cooper replied smoothly. "We want to make sure we're not missing anything that could cause problems down the road." Elaine approached Tommy with a small cup of juice and a graham cracker. "Thought you might be getting hungry, Tommy. It might be a little while longer." "Thank you," Tommy whispered, accepting the snack with his uninjured hand. Richard checked his watch again, his facade of patience wearing thin. "Look, I understand you have procedures, but this seems excessive for a simple fall. Is there someone I can speak with about expediting this?" "Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Cooper said firmly, "I understand your frustration, but I need to be thorough with Tommy's examination. Children's injuries can be more complex than they initially appear." As they spoke, Elaine noticed Mia Patel appearing at the nurse's station, nodding subtly to indicate she'd arrived and contacted CPS. Elaine also saw 2 hospital security officers taking positions nearby, maintaining a casual appearance while ensuring they were available if needed. "Mr. Blackwood," Elaine said, "while we're waiting for the X-ray team, perhaps you could help us complete Tommy's medical history? Dr. Cooper needs some additional information." "I've already given his history to 3 different people," Richard replied, his tone sharpening. "Just a few specific questions," Dr. Cooper interjected smoothly. If we could step over to the consultation room, it would be helpful. Nurse Winters will stay with Tommy. Richard hesitated, glancing at Tommy with an expression that made the boy shrink back slightly. It'll just take a few minutes, Dr. Cooper assured him, gesturing toward the small consultation room across the hall. After a moment's pause, Richard nodded. Fine. Tommy, behave yourself. I'll be right back. As soon as Richard left with Dr. Cooper, Elaine moved to Tommy's side. Mia Patel slipped into the bay, introducing herself quietly to Tommy. Tommy, this is Ms. Patel. She's here to help us make sure you're safe. Tommy looked between them, fear and confusion warring in his expression. Is he going to be mad? You don't need to worry about that anymore, Elaine assured him, careful not to make promises she couldn't keep but determined to protect this child. Can you tell Ms. Patel what you told me? About how you really got hurt? Tommy hesitated, then looked toward the consultation room where his stepfather sat with his back to them. He can't hear you, Mia reassured him gently. And you're not in any trouble. We just want to understand what happened so we can help. Tommy drew a shaky breath, his small fingers twisting the hem of his shirt. He looked up at Elaine, seeking reassurance. She nodded encouragingly, and in that moment, something shifted in his expression. A fragile trust forming, perhaps the first he'd experienced in a long time. He twisted my arm. Tommy began, his voice barely above a whisper. Because I spilled juice on his work papers. He said I did it on purpose, but I didn't. It was an accident. As Tommy began to reveal the truth, Elaine positioned herself to block his view of the hallway, creating a protective barrier between this brave little boy and the man who had terrorized him. Outside, she knew, the system she'd set in motion was gearing up. CPS workers were en route, police had been notified, and Dr. Cooper was keeping Richard occupied. For now, though, her world narrowed to this examination bay, to the pale-faced child with haunting blue eyes who had found the courage to whisper his truth. And in the sterile fluorescence of the emergency room, that whisper had the power to change everything. Mia Patel's presence brought a quiet authority to Bay 3. With her crisp blazer and compassionate eyes, she represented the bridge between medical intervention and legal protection, a role she'd performed for over a decade at Mercy General. She pulled a small stool beside the examination table where Tommy sat, positioning herself at his eye level. Tommy, I'd like to take some notes while we talk, if that's okay with you, she explained, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact. Children, she'd found, responded better to honesty than to sugar-coated reassurances. Tommy glanced again toward the consultation room where Richard sat with Dr. Cooper, the adult voices a muffled murmur through the glass partition. Elaine shifted slightly, blocking his view. He can't see you either, she assured him. Tommy nodded to Mia, a barely perceptible movement. His knuckles remained white where they gripped the edge of the examination table, his injured wrist cradled protectively against his chest. Can you tell me more about what happens when your stepfather gets angry? Mia asked, her pen poised above her notepad. Tommy swallowed hard. He says I need discipline. The word sounded foreign in his young voice, clearly parroted from adult language. When I break rules or make noise when he's working. And what happens when he disciplines you? Tommy's gaze dropped to the floor. Sometimes he uses his belt, or makes me stand in the corner for hours. His voice dropped even lower. Or puts me in the basement. The basement, Mia prompted gently. It's cold down there. And dark. There's just this little window up high, and spiders. Tommy's breathing quickened. Sometimes he leaves me there overnight. Once it was 2 whole days, I think. I had to use a bucket for the bathroom. Elaine felt a cold rage building inside her chest, but kept her expression professionally neutral. She'd seen many abuse cases over the years. Each one ignited that same protective fury, but experience had taught her to channel it into methodical action rather than emotional reactions. Does your mom know about this? Mia asked. Tommy's face crumpled slightly. She tries to stop him sometimes, but then he hurts her too. He looked up at Elaine with frightened eyes. He said if I ever told anyone, he'd hurt her so bad she'd have to go to the hospital. And then I'd go to foster care where people hurt kids even worse. Mia made notes, her pen moving steadily across the page despite the horror of what she was documenting. Tommy, has your stepfather ever hurt you in other ways? Ways that might be hard to talk about. Tommy looked confused for a moment, then shook his head. Just hitting and the basement, and sometimes not letting me eat if I'm bad. Elaine and Mia exchanged a glance. Sexual abuse often accompanied physical abuse, but Tommy's response seemed genuine. It was one small mercy in an otherwise grim situation. When did your wrist get hurt, Tommy? Was it today? Elaine asked. Tommy shook his head. Monday. He got mad because I didn't finish my homework before he got home from work. That's 3 days ago, Elaine noted. Another confirmation that Richard's story was fabricated. Has it been hurting the whole time? Tommy nodded. Mom wanted to bring me to the doctor yesterday, but he said I was fine. Mia continued her gentle questioning, building a timeline of abuse that stretched back to Richard's entry into Tommy's life 2 years earlier. As they talked, Elaine kept a watchful eye on the consultation room, where Dr. Cooper was still engaged in conversation with Richard. Through the glass, she could see Richard's growing agitation. Checking his watch, gesturing emphatically. Tommy, Elaine said, you've been very brave telling us the truth. We're going to make sure you stay safe now. Tommy's eyes widened with a mixture of hope and fear. What's going to happen? Before Elaine could answer, the emergency department doors slid open, admitting a rush of cold night air and a frantic woman in her early 30s. Her blonde hair was hastily pulled back, her coat buttoned incorrectly as if she'd dressed in a hurry. Her eyes darted around the waiting area before she approached the reception desk. Jessica, Tommy whispered, spotting his mother. Elaine felt a surge of both relief and apprehension. The mother's arrival complicated matters, but could also provide crucial information. That's your mom? She confirmed. Tommy nodded, his eyes not leaving Jessica as she spoke urgently with the reception nurse, who pointed toward Bay 3. When Jessica turned and saw Tommy, her face flooded with relief. She rushed toward him, oblivious to Mia's and Elaine's presence until she was nearly at the bedside. Tommy! Oh God! Are you okay? I got home and the neighbor said Richard brought you to the hospital. She broke off, finally registering the two women. Her hand flew to her mouth when she saw Tommy's wrist. What happened? Before Tommy could speak, Jessica's gaze landed on the bruises visible on his torso, where his t-shirt was still off. Something shifted in her expression. A flash of recognition quickly replaced by a rehearsed concern. Did you fall off your bike, sweetie? Richard left me a message about your bike. The practiced nature of the question told Elaine everything. Jessica was part of the cover-up, whether through fear, coercion, or some complex mixture of both that often characterized abusive domestic relationships. Mrs. Mills, Elaine said, I'm Nurse Winters. This is Mia Patel, our hospital social worker. Jessica's posture stiffened immediately. Her eyes, the same startling blue as Tommy's, widened with alarm. Social worker? She repeated, her voice rising slightly. Why would... Tommy just had an accident. Mrs. Mills, Mia said gently. We have some concerns about Tommy's injuries. They don't appear consistent with a bicycle fall. Jessica's gaze darted to the consultation room, where she'd spotted Richard. He was now standing, gesturing as he spoke to Dr. Cooper, clearly becoming more agitated. Her hand moved unconsciously to her throat in a protective gesture. I don't understand, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Tommy's always been active, always getting scrapes and bruises. Jessica, Elaine said, using her first name deliberately to establish connection. Tommy's wrist fracture is at least 3 days old, not from today. And there are other injuries, cigarette burns, belt marks, that couldn't possibly come from falling off a bicycle. Jessica's face paled, but she maintained her denial. You're mistaken. Richard said, I don't have a bike. Tommy interrupted softly. Mom, I told them. Jessica froze, her gaze locking with her son's. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, that the carefully maintained facade was crumbling. Fear flashed across her features, followed by a cascade of other emotions. Shame, guilt, and beneath it all, a trace of relief. "Jessica," Mia said, "Tommy has told us about the basement, about the punishments, about Richard hurting both of you." Jessica's hands began to tremble. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You can't. Hill, we can help you both," Elaine said firmly. "But we need you to be honest with us." Jessica sank onto the edge of the examination table beside Tommy, her composure fracturing. Almost unconsciously, she pulled the collar of her blouse higher, but not before Elaine glimpsed the purple-yellow bruising at her collarbone. "How long has he been hurting you too?" Elaine asked quietly. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she whispered. "At first, he was so good to us. Tommy's father left when I was pregnant, and we were struggling. Richard seemed like a miracle." She brushed a tear away. "By the time I realized who he really was, it was too late. He controlled everything. Our money, where we went, who we talked to." "When did he start hurting Tommy?" Mia asked, still documenting. "About a year ago. I tried to stop him. I swear I tried." Jessica's voice broke. "But he said if I ever tried to leave, he'd find us. He said he'd kill me and Tommy would end up in the system." She looked up at Elaine, naked fear in her eyes. "My sister tried to help us leave 6 months ago. He found us at her apartment, dragged us back. He broke her arm. After that, I was too scared to try again." "Has he hurt you tonight?" Elaine asked, noting Jessica's stiff movements. Jessica hesitated, then nodded slightly. "When he called about bringing Tommy to the hospital. I wasn't at work like he told you. He doesn't let me work anymore. I was at home and I wanted to come with them, but he said no. When I insisted, She gestured vaguely at her ribs. "He said he'd deal with it, make up a story. He always does." While they spoke, Elaine noticed Dr. Cooper had moved to stand between Richard and the curtained bay, effectively blocking his view. The security officers had also shifted position, moving closer to the consultation room. Through the glass, she could see Richard becoming increasingly animated, pointing toward Bay 3 and checking his watch repeatedly. "Jessica," Mia said, "we've contacted Child Protective Services. They're on their way. Given what Tommy has disclosed and what we're seeing, they'll likely recommend emergency protective custody." Fresh panic flashed across Jessica's face. "You're taking Tommy away?" "Not from you," Mia clarified. "The goal would be to place you both in emergency shelter tonight, away from Richard, while a protection order is processed." "He'll find us," Jessica whispered, the fear in her voice palpable. "He always does." "Not this time," Elaine assured her. "The police have been called as well. With your testimony and Tommy's, plus the medical evidence, there's enough to arrest Richard tonight." Jessica's breathing quickened to near hyperventilation. "You don't understand. He has friends in the department. He's a financial advisor for half the police pension fund. That's why I never reported, never called." Mia placed a calming hand on Jessica's arm. "Jessica, I know this is overwhelming, but right now, I need you to focus on Tommy and yourself. Will you let us photograph your injuries as well? It will strengthen the case." Jessica looked at Tommy, who was watching her with a mixture of fear and hope. In that moment, Elaine could almost see the mental calculations happening behind Jessica's eyes, weighing years of terror against the fragile possibility of escape. When she finally nodded, it seemed to require her entire reserve of courage. "Okay," she whispered, "but you can't let him near Tommy. Not for a second." "I promise," Elaine said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. While Mia took Jessica to a private examination room to document her injuries, Elaine stayed with Tommy. Through the glass partition of the consultation room, she could see that Richard's patience had finally snapped. He was standing now, voice raised enough that muffled fragments carried across the ER. Dr. Cooper, an experienced hand at managing difficult situations, maintained his professional calm, but Elaine could see the tension in his posture. "Is my mom going to be okay?" Tommy asked, watching the same scene. Yes, Elaine assured him, hoping she was right. Ms. Patel is helping her right now. And soon, some people from an agency called Child Protective Services will come to help make sure you both stay safe. Away from Richard? Yes, away from Richard. Tommy absorbed this, his small face serious. He's really mad now, he observed, watching his stepfather's gesticulations through the glass. You don't need to worry about that, Elaine said, though she was concerned herself. Richard's escalating behavior suggested he was realizing that his control was slipping. Men like Richard, she knew from experience, became most dangerous when they felt their power threatened. She was just about to suggest a distraction when the consultation room door flew open. Richard strode out, Dr. Cooper following close behind. The security officers straightened, alert to the sudden movement. Enough of this, Richard announced, his voice carrying across the ER. We've been here for nearly 3 hours for a simple sprain. I'm taking my stepson home. He stalked toward Bay 3, his expression thunderous. Elaine stepped forward, placing herself between Richard and Tommy. Mr. Blackwood, we haven't completed Tommy's examination yet, she said firmly, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the alarm bells ringing in her head. Where's his mother? Richard demanded, noticing Jessica's absence. Did she finally show up? Mrs. Mills is speaking with our social worker, Dr. Cooper interjected, having caught up to Richard. Standard procedure for pediatric injuries. Richard's face flushed. Social worker? What the hell for? This is ridiculous. Tommy, get your shirt on. We're leaving. Tommy shrank back on the examination table, his eyes wide with fear. Elaine remained planted in Richard's path. I'm afraid Tommy can't leave yet, she said, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. We're still waiting on the X-ray results, and there are some additional concerns we need to address. Richard stepped closer, using his height to loom over Elaine. She caught the scent of expensive cologne undercut with the sharper smell of sweat. His voice dropped to a dangerous register. Listen to me very carefully. That is my stepson. I brought him in for treatment, which you failed to provide in a timely manner. Now I'm taking him home. If you try to stop me, I'll have this entire hospital slapped with a lawsuit before morning. Before Elaine could respond, the curtain behind her moved. Jessica stepped through, Mia following close behind. Richard's attention snapped to his wife, his expression shifting from anger to something more calculating. Jessica, good you're here. Help Tommy get dressed. We're leaving this circus. Jessica flinched at the command in his voice, a reaction born from years of conditioning. But then something unexpected happened. She straightened her shoulders and moved to stand beside Elaine, placing herself between Richard and Tommy. No, Richard, she said, her voice trembling but determined. We're not going with you. The silence that followed was electric. Richard stared at Jessica as if she'd suddenly begun speaking in tongues. Then his expression darkened further. What did you say to me? He asked, his voice dangerously soft. I said no. Jessica's voice grew firmer with each word. They know, Richard. They know about Tommy's wrist, about the basement, about everything. For a split second, Richard's mask slipped completely, revealing a fury so raw that everyone in the vicinity tensed. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, replaced by a calm more frightening than the rage. I don't know what you're talking about, he said evenly. Tommy fell off his bike. Jessica, you're clearly hysterical. Let's discuss this at home. Mr. Blackwood, Mia interjected. Child Protective Services has been contacted regarding concerns of potential abuse. They've requested that Tommy remain in the hospital until they arrive. Richard's gaze snapped to her. Based on what? The imagination of an overtired child? Or my emotionally unstable wife? He turned to Dr. Cooper. Doctor, surely you recognize a case of parental alienation when you see one. Jessica and I have been having some marital difficulties. She's clearly using Tommy to punish me. The medical evidence doesn't support your explanation of Tommy's injuries, Dr. Cooper replied firmly. The fracture pattern and aging of the bruises are inconsistent with a bicycle accident from today. A muscle twitched in Richard's jaw. Elaine could almost see him recalculating, looking for another angle of attack. "Fine," he said after a moment. "Have your x-rays. Complete your examination. But I'll be staying right here with my stepson." He fixed Jessica with a look that made her shrink back slightly. "And then we'll all go home and sort this out as a family." The implicit threat in his words hung in the air. Elaine exchanged glances with Mia and Dr. Cooper, a silent communication passing between them. They needed to keep Richard contained until the police and CPS arrived. "Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Cooper said, "while you're welcome to stay, I must ask that you remain in the waiting area. Hospital policy limits the number of people in examination bays." "That's my stepson," Richard countered. "And my wife. I have every right—" "Sir," interrupted a deep voice. One of the security officers had approached, his presence solid and reassuring. "I need to ask you to step back to the waiting area as the doctor requested." Richard looked from the officer to Dr. Cooper, then to Jessica and Tommy. Calculation played across his features as he weighed his options. Finally, he nodded, his business persona sliding back into place. "Of course, I understand hospital protocols. I'll be right outside, Jessica." His tone carried a warning. "Don't do anything you'll regret." As Richard reluctantly moved to the waiting area, escorted by the security officer, Elaine noticed his hand slip into his pocket, retrieving his phone. He began typing rapidly, his expression grim. She felt a new wave of concern. Was he contacting someone? An attorney? Or, more worryingly, one of the police contacts Jessica had mentioned? "He's calling someone," Jessica whispered, having noticed the same thing. "He always has a plan B. Always." Before Elaine could respond, the emergency department doors opened again. Two individuals entered, a woman in her 40s with a practical bob and a leather portfolio, accompanied by a younger man in a button-down shirt and khakis. They approached the nurse's station, presented identification, and were directed toward Bay 3. "CPS," Mia murmured, recognizing the pair. "Let me handle the initial contact." While Mia stepped away to brief the CPS workers, Elaine remained with Jessica and Tommy. The boy had grown increasingly pale, overwhelmed by the chaos swirling around him. Elaine checked his vital signs again, concerned about the toll the stress was taking. "How about we get you a little more comfortable?" she suggested, adjusting the examination table to a semi-reclined position. "You've been sitting up for a long time." Tommy nodded gratefully, leaning back as Elaine arranged a pillow behind him. Jessica hovered close, clearly torn between staying at her son's side and watching Richard in the waiting area. "He's not going to give up," she said quietly to Elaine. "You don't know him like I do. He'll find a way to twist this, to make it seem like I'm the unstable one. He's done it before." "The medical evidence is clear," Elaine reassured her. "And Tommy's statement can be questioned," Jessica interrupted. "He'll say I coached Tommy, that I'm poisoning him against his stepfather. He's a financial advisor for half the judges in the county. People listen when he talks." The fear in Jessica's voice was so raw, so visceral, that Elaine couldn't dismiss it. In her years as an ER nurse, she'd seen how systems designed to protect the vulnerable could fail them, how abusers with resources and social standing could manipulate those systems to their advantage. "Jessica," Elaine said, placing a hand on the frightened woman's arm, "I believe you. Dr. Cooper believes you. We will make sure your voice is heard." Jessica's eyes, so like Tommy's, filled with tears. "Do you promise?" Before Elaine could answer, raised voices from the waiting area caught their attention. Richard was engaged in an animated conversation with someone who had just arrived, a man in plain clothes with the unmistakable bearing of a police officer. The man clapped Richard on the shoulder in a gesture of familiarity. Jessica's face drained of color. "That's Detective Harmon," she whispered. "He's Richard's golf partner. I told you he had friends in the department." Across the ER, Mia and the CPS workers noticed the new arrival as well. The older woman from CPS was already moving toward the detective, her expression firm. Dr. Cooper joined her, creating a unified front. Elaine watched as a quiet power struggle unfolded in the waiting area. Richard and his police ally on one side, the CPS workers and Dr. Cooper on the other. Words were exchanged, identification presented, policies cited. Richard's confidence seemed to grow with the detective's arrival, his posture relaxing into the assured stance of a man who believed the tide was turning in his favor. "He's going to win again," Jessica murmured, watching the same scene. "He always does." In that moment, Elaine made a decision. She'd followed protocols, activated the system, documented the evidence. But systems could fail, especially when manipulated by people with influence. Sometimes, protection required a more direct approach. "Jessica," she said quietly, "is there someone you trust completely? Someone Richard doesn't know about, or wouldn't think to check with?" Jessica thought for a moment. "My college roommate, Diane. She lives in Vermont now. Richard never met her. We reconnected on social media last year, but I kept it secret from him. Does she have her own place? Would she take you in temporarily?" Understanding dawned in Jessica's eyes. "You think we should run?" "Not run," Elaine clarified. "Relocate to safety while the legal process unfolds. My brother is a lawyer who specializes in domestic violence cases. He's helped arrange emergency relocations before, completely above board and legally protected." Hope flickered across Jessica's face, quickly followed by doubt. "But they'll be watching us now. Richard, the detective, they won't just let us walk out." Elaine squeezed her arm reassuringly. "Let me make a call. There might be another way." As Elaine stepped away to contact her brother, she glanced back at Tommy, now half asleep on the examination table, exhausted by fear and pain and the weight of his own brave truth. In the sterile fluorescence of the emergency room, his small form seemed impossibly vulnerable. The system should protect him, but Elaine had seen enough to know that sometimes the system needed help. And sometimes that help came in the form of people willing to stand in the gap. Nurses who listened to whispered truths, mothers who found their courage, and those who understood that sometimes safety required extraordinary measures. In the waiting area, Richard was smiling now, the detective's hand on his shoulder. Elaine turned away from the sight, her resolve hardening. The night was far from over, and the true battle for Tommy's safety had only just begun. Elaine Winters ended her call and slipped her phone back into her scrubs pocket. Her brother, Mike, had been clear. Document everything, follow every protocol, and most importantly, maintain a continuous chain of custody for Tommy. If Richard had connections within the police department, the only defense was procedural perfection. As she returned to Bay 3, a palpable tension had settled over the emergency department. In the waiting area, Richard continued his hushed conversation with Detective Harmon, while the CPS caseworkers and Dr. Cooper seemed to be in a standoff with them. Hospital security had positioned themselves strategically, not overtly threatening, but present enough to make a statement. "Nurse Winters," called Vivian Moore, the senior CPS caseworker. "Could we have a word?" Elaine approached the group, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the churning in her stomach. Up close, Detective Harmon looked every bit the picture of authority. Salt and pepper hair cropped close, shoulders squared beneath his sport coat, badge clipped to his belt. His expression was neutral, but his eyes held a coldness that sent a warning signal through Elaine's body. "Detective Harmon is concerned that we may be overreacting to a simple accident," Vivian explained, her tone making it clear she disagreed. "He's suggested that the child could be released to Mr. Blackwood's custody tonight while the investigation proceeds." Richard stood slightly behind the detective, his expression a perfect mask of concerned confusion. "I just want to take my family home," he said, his voice calibrated to project reasonable frustration. "This has been traumatic enough for Tommy." Elaine met Vivian's eyes, a silent communication passing between them. Both women had seen this dynamic play out before. The powerful man, the official ally, the system bending to accommodate them. "The medical evidence doesn't support Mr. Blackwood's account," Elaine stated firmly. "Tommy's wrist fracture is days old, not hours." He has cigarette burns on his arms and belt marks on his back. Alleged cigarette burns, Detective Harmon corrected. Children get all kinds of marks that can be misinterpreted. And as for the timing of the injury, isn't it possible the mother simply misremembered? Stress affects people's recall. Tommy himself disclosed the abuse, Elaine countered, and his mother has confirmed it. A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed Richard's carefully composed features. My wife is under a great deal of strain. She's been struggling with anxiety, hasn't been herself lately. As for Tommy, children can be influenced by leading questions. No one led the child, Vivian interjected, her years of experience evident in her firm tone. And our preliminary assessment indicates substantial risk if he returns home. Detective Harmon sighed, as if dealing with stubborn children. Look, I understand everyone's doing their job here, but let's not turn a family disagreement into a criminal case before we have all the facts. Richard here is a respected member of the community, not some criminal, Dr. Cooper finished, joining the conversation. Detective, with all due respect, social standing doesn't immunize anyone from abusing a child. The medical evidence is clear, and in my professional judgment, returning this child to Mr. Blackwood would constitute negligence on our part. Tension crackled in the air as the two men stared at each other. Before Detective Harmon could respond, the emergency department doors slid open again, admitting two uniformed police officers. They paused at the reception desk, then headed toward the group. Officers Adams and Rodriguez. The female officer introduced them, nodding to Detective Harmon. We were dispatched for a child abuse report. Relief washed through Elaine. These were regular patrol officers, not detectives from Harmon's division. The system hadn't completely failed yet. Detective Harmon stepped forward. I've got this covered. Simple misunderstanding that's being resolved. Officer Rodriguez frowned slightly. Dispatch said CPS requested police presence for a protective custody situation. That's why we were sent directly. And we're still making that request, Vivian confirmed, stepping forward with her credentials. We've initiated emergency protective custody based on medical evidence and the child's disclosure of ongoing physical abuse. A muscle twitched in Detective Harmon's jaw. This is my jurisdiction, officers. I'll handle the follow-up. With respect, Detective, Officer Adams replied, if CPS has initiated protective custody, our procedure is to secure the child's safety first, then coordinate with detectives after. Richard's mask of calm was beginning to slip. He moved closer to Detective Harmon, whispering something in his ear. The detective nodded slightly, then addressed the officers again. Fine. Follow protocol. But I'll be overseeing this case personally. He turned to Richard. Don't worry. This will get sorted out. As the power dynamics shifted in the waiting area, Elaine seized the opportunity to return to Bay 3, where Jessica sat beside Tommy, her hand gently stroking his hair as he dozed fitfully. Mia remained with them, her protective presence a buffer against the storm brewing outside. What's happening? Jessica asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Richard's friend is here, isn't he? The detective. Yes, Elaine confirmed, seeing no point in sugarcoating the situation. But two patrol officers have also arrived, and the CPS workers are standing firm. They're initiating emergency protective custody. Jessica's relief was visible, but short-lived. It won't be enough. Richard always finds a way. That detective will help him spin this, find some loophole. Not this time, Elaine assured her, though her own confidence was far from complete. The medical evidence is clear and Tommy's statement can be challenged, Jessica finished. Richard will say I coached him, that I'm mentally unstable, that I'm trying to poison Tommy against him. He's done it before when I tried to get help from my doctor. He convinced them I was having delusions. The weight of Jessica's fear was palpable, and Elaine couldn't dismiss it. Systems designed to protect the vulnerable too often failed them, especially when the abuser had resources, connections, and social credibility. Jessica, Elaine said, lowering her voice, my brother is a lawyer who specializes in domestic violence cases. He says the most important thing right now is to maintain an unbroken chain of custody for Tommy. Don't leave the hospital without formal protection in place. Jessica nodded, then tensed as voices from the waiting area grew louder. Through the gap in the curtain, they could see Richard becoming more animated, gesturing emphatically as he spoke to Detective Harmon and the patrol officers. "He's losing control," Jessica whispered, a tremor in her voice. "That's when he's most dangerous." As if confirming her words, Richard suddenly broke away from the group and strode toward Bay 3. His face flushed with anger. The patrol officers moved to intercept him, but Detective Harmon stepped between them, creating just enough confusion to give Richard a lead. "I want to speak to my wife," Richard announced loudly. "That's my legal right." Elaine positioned herself at the entrance to Bay 3. Behind her, Jessica had risen to her feet, while Mia moved protectively closer to Tommy, who had startled awake at the commotion. "Mr. Blackwood," Elaine said firmly, "this is a patient care area. I need to ask you to step back." Richard stopped just short of her, using his height to loom over her. His expensive cologne couldn't mask the acid smell of sweat and fury. "You're interfering with my family," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "You have no idea what you've started." "Richard," Jessica called from behind Elaine, her voice steadier than Elaine had expected. "Just stop. It's over." Something dangerous flashed across Richard's features, a raw, unfiltered rage that transformed his handsome face into something almost unrecognizable. In that moment, Elaine saw the real man beneath the polished exterior, the monster that Tommy and Jessica had been living with. "Nothing is over until I say it's over," Richard growled. Officer Rodriguez appeared at his side. "Sir, I need you to step back into the waiting area now." Richard ignored her, his focus laser-sharp on Jessica. "You think they can protect you? You think you can take my family from me? This isn't over, Jessica. Not even close." Elaine felt a chill at the unmistakable threat in his words. She glanced at Tommy, who had shrunk back against the examination table, his small face pale with terror. "Richard Blackwood," Officer Adams said firmly, joining his partner, "you need to step away from this area immediately." For a tense moment, Richard remained frozen, his body coiled with fury. Then, abruptly, he seemed to collect himself. The mask of civility slipped back into place, though it fit imperfectly now, like a suit that had been torn and hastily repaired. "Of course, officer," he said, his voice returning to its smooth, professional register. "I'm merely concerned about my family. This has all been a terrible misunderstanding." As the officers escorted Richard back to the waiting area, Elaine exhaled slowly, aware that the confrontation had been defused but not resolved. Jessica sank back onto her chair, trembling slightly. "You see?" she whispered. "That's who he really is. That's who we've been living with." Tommy remained silent, but his eyes followed Richard's retreating form with a mixture of fear and something else. Perhaps the first fragile stirrings of hope that the nightmare might actually end. Dr. Cooper approached, his expression grim. "The officers are going to remain with Mr. Blackwood while CPS completes their initial assessment. Vivian would like to speak with you both now, Jessica." As Dr. Cooper escorted Jessica and Mia to a private consultation room to meet with the CPS workers, Elaine stayed with Tommy. The X-ray technician had arrived, and the process of documenting Tommy's injuries continued, each image adding to the case against Richard. "Is my mom okay?" Tommy asked as Elaine gently positioned his wrist for the X-ray. "Yes," Elaine assured him. "She's talking to some people who are going to help make sure you both stay safe." Tommy nodded, processing this. "Richard is really mad," he observed quietly. "You don't need to worry about that," Elaine said, though she was concerned herself. Richard's behavior was growing increasingly erratic, a dangerous sign in an abuser who felt his control slipping away. After the X-rays were completed, Elaine returned Tommy to Bay 3. The emergency department had grown quieter as the night progressed, the typical lull before the early morning rush. Through the waiting area windows, she could see Richard seated between the two patrol officers, Detective Harmon standing nearby, speaking into his phone. "Would you like something to drink, Tommy?" Elaine asked, trying to establish some normalcy amid the chaos. "We have apple juice or ginger ale." "Apple juice, please," Tommy replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Elaine was just turning toward the supply room when a commotion erupted in the waiting area. Richard had apparently received a phone call, and whatever news he'd received had triggered another outburst. He was on his feet, gesticulating wildly as Detective Harmon tried to calm him. Officer Rodriguez moved between Richard and the doors to Bay 3, her hand resting on her belt in a clear warning. Officer Adams spoke into his radio, likely calling for backup. "What's happening?" Tommy asked, his voice rising with alarm. Before Elaine could answer, Richard made a sudden move, not toward Bay 3, but toward the emergency exit. Officer Adams lunged to intercept him, but Richard feinted left, then darted right, evading the officer's grasp. In seconds, he had disappeared through the exit door, triggering the alarm. The emergency department erupted into controlled chaos. The patrol officers gave chase, radioing for assistance. Detective Harmon followed more slowly, his expression unreadable. Hospital security moved to secure the remaining exits. Elaine's first thought was for Tommy's safety. "Stay right here," she instructed, drawing the privacy curtain fully closed. "I'm going to check on your mom." She hurried to the consultation room where Jessica was meeting with the CPS workers. The sound of the alarm had already alerted them. Jessica was on her feet, her face drained of color. "Richard's left the building," Elaine explained quickly. "The police are pursuing him. I need to get back to Tommy, but I wanted to make sure you were aware." "Oh God," Jessica whispered. "He's going to get something from the house. A weapon or—" Vivian Moore, the CPS caseworker, stepped forward. "We need to move you and Tommy to a secure location immediately. Is there a room in the hospital where they can wait while we arrange transport?" Dr. Cooper, who had joined them at the sound of the alarm, nodded. "We can use the secure room in the pediatric wing. It's designed for situations like this, controlled access, no windows." "I'll stay with them," Elaine volunteered, her protective instinct fully engaged. As they prepared to move Jessica and Tommy, Officer Rodriguez returned, slightly out of breath. "We lost him," she reported grimly. "He had a car waiting in the ambulance bay. Someone must have been helping him. We've got units searching, but he's gone," Jessica finished, her voice hollow with dread. The officer nodded. "For now, we've put out an APB, and Detective Harmon is coordinating with other units." She hesitated, then added, "Ma'am, is there anywhere your husband might go? Anywhere he would consider safe?" Jessica laughed bitterly. "Richard has properties all over the city. Rental units, investments, places I don't even know about. That's how he operates. Always a backup plan, always an escape route." "We need to move now," Vivian insisted. "Every minute increases the risk." Dr. Cooper led the way as they returned to Bay 3. Tommy was sitting exactly where Elaine had left him, his eyes wide with fear at the commotion. "We're going to a different room, Tommy," Elaine explained, keeping her voice calm. "Somewhere quieter, where you and your mom can rest a bit." Tommy nodded, sliding off the examination table. When Jessica entered, he ran to her, wrapping his good arm around her waist. She knelt to embrace him, her own fear momentarily masked by maternal comfort. "It's okay, sweetheart," she murmured. "We're going to be okay." As they prepared to move to the secure room, Officer Rodriguez positioned herself as escort. The hospital security team had been alerted, and additional personnel were on their way to strengthen the perimeter. The system was working, protocols followed, backup called, safety measures implemented. Yet Elaine couldn't shake the cold dread that had settled in her stomach. Richard had resources, connections, and most dangerously, nothing to lose. They were moving toward the corridor that led to the pediatric wing when the emergency department doors slid open once more. Richard Blackwood stood there, his expensive blazer disheveled, his face a mask of cold fury, and in his hand, partially concealed but unmistakable, was the metallic glint of a handgun. Time seemed to slow. Officer Rodriguez reached for her weapon, positioning herself between Richard and the group. Hospital staff froze in place, trained to respond to armed threats but still human enough to feel the paralyzing surge of adrenaline. "Jessica," Richard called, his voice eerily calm now. "Take Tommy and come here. Now." Jessica's arms tightened around Tommy, who had begun to tremble violently. "Richard." Detective Harmon's voice cut through the tension as he appeared behind Richard. "Put the weapon down. This isn't the way." Richard didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the detective. His focus remained entirely on Jessica and Tommy, as if the rest of the emergency department had ceased to exist. "3 seconds, Jessica," he said, raising the gun slightly. "Or I start shooting, and I won't start with you." Officer Rodriguez had her weapon drawn now, her stance steady despite the impossible situation. A crowded emergency department, civilian staff and patients everywhere. No clear shot. "Mr. Blackwood," she called firmly, "lower your weapon and put your hands up." For the first time, Richard seemed to register the officer's presence. A smile, cold, calculating, spread across his face. "You won't shoot," he said with chilling confidence. "Too many innocent bystanders. Too much liability. So here's what's going to happen. My wife and stepson are going to walk over here, and we're going to leave. Anyone who tries to stop us will regret it." The standoff stretched, seconds feeling like hours. Elaine glanced around desperately for options. Any way to protect Tommy and Jessica, any route to safety. That's when she saw it. The supply cart just behind Richard, temporarily forgotten in the crisis. Standard emergency department equipment, including several canisters of compressed oxygen. Highly pressurized, highly volatile when compromised. An idea formed, dangerous, potentially catastrophic, but perhaps their only chance. Elaine caught Dr. Cooper's eye, then glanced meaningfully at the oxygen canisters. He followed her gaze, a flash of understanding crossing his features. "Richard," Dr. Cooper called, drawing the man's attention. "Let's talk about this. You're a rational man. There's a better way to resolve this situation." As Dr. Cooper engaged Richard, Elaine slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to edge toward the nearby crash cart. On it lay a defibrillator, standard equipment for cardiac emergencies, but in this moment, potentially a different kind of lifesaver. Richard was responding to Dr. Cooper, his attention momentarily diverted. "There's nothing to discuss. My family is coming with me, and..." Elaine moved in a blur of action, grabbing the defibrillator paddles and adjusting the settings to maximum. With one fluid motion, she slammed the charged paddles against the nearby metal surface, creating a shower of sparks that arced toward the oxygen canisters. "Get down!" she shouted. The resulting explosion wasn't large. Oxygen doesn't burn, but it vigorously supports combustion. The canister ruptured with a deafening bang, sending a pressurized blast of air through the emergency department. The concussive force was enough to knock Richard off balance, the gun wavering in his hand. Officer Rodriguez seized the opportunity, tackling Richard to the ground as Detective Harmon and hospital security converged. The gun skittered across the floor, coming to rest against a wall. In the chaotic seconds that followed, Elaine's focus remained singular: protect Tommy and Jessica. She rushed them away from the confrontation, toward the secure room that had been their original destination. Behind them, the sounds of struggle faded as Richard was subdued and restrained. His shouts of rage gave way to threats, then to demands for a lawyer. The system had engaged fully now. Additional police had arrived, hospital protocols for armed threats had been activated, and the legal machinery for protecting abuse victims had begun to turn. Inside the secure room, Tommy clung to his mother, his small body shaking with the aftermath of terror. Jessica wasn't much steadier, her face pale with shock, her breathing ragged. "Is he gone?" Tommy whispered. "Really gone?" Elaine knelt beside them, her own adrenaline still coursing but her voice steady. "Yes, Tommy. The police have him now. He can't hurt you anymore." Jessica looked at Elaine, a complex mixture of emotions playing across her features: gratitude, disbelief, and the first tentative glimmerings of hope. You risked your life, she said softly. For us. For strangers. Elaine shook her head. You're not strangers. Not anymore. As the night gave way to the earliest hints of dawn, Elaine stayed with them, her presence a steady anchor in the aftermath of violence. Outside the secure room, the system continued its work. Richard was processed into custody, charges were filed, protective orders were initiated. The legal machinery, once engaged, had its own momentum. But inside this quiet room, something more fundamental was happening. A small boy who had found the courage to whisper his truth was beginning to understand that some adults could be trusted. A mother who had been trapped in the prison of fear was taking her first breaths of freedom. And a nurse who had trusted her instincts was witnessing the first fragile moments of healing. The night had been long, filled with danger and fear. But as the first pale light of morning filtered through the high windows of the pediatric wing, it illuminated 3 people bound together by circumstance and courage, survivors of a storm that had finally begun to pass. The hospital room in the pediatric wing bore little resemblance to the sterile examination bay where Tommy had first whispered his truth. Cheerful murals of woodland creatures adorned the walls, and the morning sunlight filtering through the blinds cast a warm glow across the room. Tommy lay sleeping in the standard hospital bed, which looked enormous around his small frame. His injured wrist had been properly set and cast during the night, a blue cast, his choice when offered options. Jessica dozed in the recliner beside him, her body curved protectively toward her son even in sleep. Elaine paused in the doorway, reluctant to disturb their rest. Her shift had officially ended hours ago, but she'd stayed through the night, unwilling to leave until she was certain of their safety. The events in the emergency department, Richard's appearance with the gun, the chaotic moments that followed, had led to his arrest on multiple serious charges. With no possibility of immediate bail, Tommy and Jessica were safe for the moment. Jessica stirred, her eyes opening to find Elaine in the doorway. She straightened, running a hand through her disheveled blonde hair. "What time is it?" she asked, her voice rough with exhaustion. "Just after 9, Elaine replied, stepping into the room. "How is he?" They both looked at Tommy, whose sleep remained mercifully undisturbed. The anxious tension that had marked his features for so long had eased somewhat, though he still looked too small, too fragile for all he had endured. "The sedative they gave him is still working," Jessica said. "The doctor said he needed the rest after." She trailed off, the events of the night still too raw to verbalize. Elaine nodded, understanding. "I wanted to check on you both before I head home. Dr. Cooper will be by later this morning, and Mia from Social Services will return around noon to discuss next steps." "Next steps?" Jessica echoed, the words hanging heavy with uncertainty. "I don't even know what those are. Where we'll go, what we'll do." Richard controlled everything. "Our bank accounts, the house, even my car is in his name." "That's what Mia will help with," Elaine assured her, taking a seat in the chair opposite Jessica. "There are resources available, legal aid, emergency housing, financial assistance." Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "I never thought I'd be here, a domestic violence victim in a hospital, with nothing but the clothes on my back." She wiped at her eyes. "I used to be a teacher, you know, before Richard. I had my own apartment, my own life. Then he came along, so charming, so concerned about Tommy having a father figure. By the time I realized who he really was—" "You don't have to explain," Elaine said gently. "Abusers are masters at isolation and control. They don't start with violence, they start with care, with solving problems, with making themselves indispensable." Jessica looked at her with surprise. "You sound like you understand." "My brother is a domestic violence attorney," Elaine explained, "and I've seen enough cases come through the ER to recognize the patterns." She hesitated, then added, "My mother was in an abusive relationship after my father died. I was 16 when we finally left." "How did you do it?" "Start over, one day at a time," Elaine said honestly. "It wasn't easy, but eventually we built a new life. One where we weren't walking on eggshells, where every decision wasn't weighed against the risk of violence." She leaned forward slightly. "It is possible, Jessica. Different, harder in some ways, but possible. Tommy stirred in the bed, mumbling something in his sleep. Both women turned to watch him, their conversation pausing until he settled again. "What happens now?" Jessica asked quietly. "With Richard, is he really going to stay in jail?" Detective Foster, she took over the case from Detective Harmon, says the charges are substantial. Assault with a deadly weapon, attempted kidnapping, child abuse, domestic violence. And with the ER security footage showing him with the gun. Elaine shook her head. "It's unlikely he'll get bail, at least initially." Relief washed over Jessica's face, followed quickly by apprehension. "But eventually there will be a trial. Tommy and I will have to testify." "That's still a way off," Elaine reassured her. "And there are protections in place for victims, especially children. Tommy might be able to testify via closed-circuit television, for instance." A soft knock on the door interrupted them. Vivian Moore, the CPS caseworker, stood in the doorway, her practical bob framing a face that looked as tired as Elaine felt. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. "I wanted to update you before the formal meeting later today." Jessica straightened, immediately alert. "Is something wrong?" "No, nothing like that," Vivian assured her, entering the room and closing the door softly behind her. "Actually, there have been some positive developments. Detective Foster executed a search warrant on your home this morning. They found substantial evidence corroborating Tommy's statements, photos documenting previous injuries, a journal Richard kept detailing disciplinary actions, and most significantly, a hidden camera system that recorded the basement where Tommy was confined." Jessica's hand flew to her mouth. "He was recording it? All of it?" Vivian nodded grimly. "It appears he kept detailed records and surveillance footage, possibly as a way to control you both through fear, or simply as a manifestation of his need for dominance. Either way, it provides compelling evidence. So Tommy won't have to testify?" Hope flickered across Jessica's exhausted features. "It's too early to say definitively," Vivian cautioned, "but this evidence significantly strengthens the case. The district attorney will make those decisions as the case progresses." Elaine watched as Jessica absorbed this information, the complex interplay of emotions, relief, horror at the invasion, anger at the methodical documentation of their suffering. "There's something else," Vivian continued, her tone softening. "The search also uncovered financial documents, accounts in your name that you may not have been aware of. It appears Richard was moving assets around, possibly in preparation for." She hesitated. "For what?" Jessica prompted. "The documents suggest he was planning to leave the country with Tommy," Vivian said carefully. "There were passport applications, correspondence with a private school in Switzerland, and wire transfers to an account there." Jessica's face drained of color. "He was going to take Tommy away from me." "It appears that way," Vivian confirmed. "But he didn't succeed. And now, this evidence further supports the need for protective custody and eliminates any question about the danger he poses." The conversation continued, delving into immediate practical concerns: Jessica's access to funds, temporary housing options, security measures. Elaine remained present, offering what support she could, but increasingly aware of her own exhaustion pressing at the edges of her consciousness. "I should let you both rest," she said finally, rising from her chair. "I'll come back later if that's all right." Jessica reached for her hand, gripping it with surprising strength. "Thank you doesn't begin to cover it," she said, her blue eyes, so like Tommy's, bright with tears. "You saved us, Elaine, not just by stopping Richard last night, but by listening to Tommy in the first place. By believing him when so many others didn't." Touched by the raw gratitude, Elaine squeezed Jessica's hand in return. "Take care of yourselves. I'll check in later." As she left the pediatric wing, the full weight of the night's events settled on Elaine's shoulders. The confrontation with Richard, the desperate gambit with the oxygen canister, the hours of uncertainty that followed. All of it crashed over her in a wave of delayed reaction. By the time she reached her car in the staff parking lot, her hands were trembling. She sat behind the wheel for several minutes, breathing deeply, allowing herself to process what had happened. In 15 years as an ER nurse, she'd faced many dangerous situations, but never one where the threat had been so deliberate, so focused on a child under her care. The image of Richard standing in the emergency department doorway, gun in hand, would likely haunt her for a long time. The drive home passed in a blur of exhaustion. Elaine's small bungalow on the outskirts of Boston welcomed her with familiar comfort. The creaking porch step, the tangle of autumn chrysanthemums she'd been meaning to tidy up, the soft jingling of her cat's collar as Jasper greeted her at the door. "Hey, buddy," she murmured, bending to stroke his orange fur. Quite a night. After feeding Jasper and taking a long, hot shower, Elaine fell into bed, pulling the covers up against the October chill that had seeped into the house overnight. Sleep came swiftly, but it wasn't restful. Her dreams filled with fragments of the night's events, distorted and amplified by her subconscious. She awoke in the late afternoon to the sound of her phone chiming. Groggy and disoriented, she fumbled for it on the nightstand. "Hello, Elaine, it's Mia Patel. I'm sorry to wake you." Instantly alert, Elaine sat up. "Is everything okay? Tommy and Jessica?" "They're safe," Mia assured her quickly. "But there's been a development. Richard Blackwood's attorney has already filed a motion challenging the protective custody order. They're claiming Jessica is mentally unstable and has coached Tommy to make false allegations." Elaine's stomach clenched. "But the evidence from the house, the recordings, the journal, is being challenged as well. They're claiming it was taken out of context, that the discipline was reasonable and the confinement was a timeout method, not abuse." "That's absurd," Elaine said, anger cutting through her fatigue. "Tommy has cigarette burns on his arms. X-rays show multiple healed fractures consistent with ongoing abuse." "I know," Mia said, her own frustration evident. "But Richard's attorney is well-connected and aggressive. They're pushing for an emergency hearing tomorrow morning." Elaine swung her legs over the side of the bed, already calculating how quickly she could get back to the hospital. "What can I do?" "Your medical documentation is crucial," Mia explained. "The detailed notes you made, the photographs, they're some of our strongest evidence. Detective Foster would like to take your formal statement this evening, if possible." "Of course," Elaine agreed immediately. "I can be back at the hospital in an hour." "Thank you," Mia said. "And Elaine, Jessica is asking for you. She's holding up remarkably well, considering everything, but I think your presence would be reassuring for her and Tommy." The thought of the small family facing yet another challenge, another fight against a system that too often favored the powerful, strengthened Elaine's resolve. "I'll be there," she promised. True to her word, Elaine arrived at the hospital an hour later, having traded her usual scrubs for jeans and a sweater since she wasn't on duty. She found Tommy's room easily, now guarded by a uniformed officer, a precaution that was both reassuring and a stark reminder of the continuing danger. Inside, the scene had changed somewhat. Tommy was awake, sitting up in bed with a tray of largely untouched hospital food before him. Jessica sat beside him, speaking softly with Detective Foster, a competent-looking woman in her 40s with close-cropped dark hair and attentive eyes. Mia stood near the window, reviewing documents on a tablet. Tommy spotted Elaine first, his face lighting up with a smile that transformed his features. "Nurse Winters," he called, more animated than she had yet seen him. Jessica and the others turned at his exclamation. Relief crossed Jessica's face. "Elaine, thank you for coming back." "Of course," Elaine replied, moving to Tommy's bedside. "How's that wrist feeling, Tommy?" He held up the blue cast proudly. "It doesn't hurt much anymore. And everyone can sign it." The cast already bore several signatures. Doctors, nurses, and a particularly elaborate one that appeared to be from Mia. "May I?" Elaine asked, pulling a pen from her purse when Tommy nodded eagerly. She signed her name with a small heart beside it, adding to the collection. "Nurse Winters," Detective Foster said, extending her hand. "I'm Detective Eliza Foster. Thank you for coming in. Your intervention last night was remarkable." Elaine shook her hand. "I just did what was necessary to protect my patient." Nevertheless, your quick thinking likely prevented a tragedy. The detective gestured toward the door. If you have time now, I'd like to take your formal statement about both the initial examination and last night's events. Of course, Elaine agreed. She turned to Tommy. I'll be back in a little while. Okay? Tommy nodded, then asked hesitantly, Is Richard still in jail? The simple question carried the weight of a child's deepest fear. Elaine met his eyes directly, knowing that honesty, delivered gently, was what he needed. Yes, Tommy, he is, and a lot of people are working very hard to make sure he stays there and can't hurt you or your mom again. Tommy absorbed this, then nodded again, some of the tension leaving his small shoulders. Okay. Elaine followed Detective Foster to a small conference room that had been set up for taking statements. Over the next 2 hours, she provided a detailed account of her interactions with Tommy and Richard, from the moment they arrived in the ER to the chaotic confrontation the night before. The detective recorded her statement, occasionally asking for clarification but mostly allowing Elaine to speak uninterrupted. Your notes on the initial examination are extraordinarily detailed, Detective Foster commented, reviewing Elaine's documentation. The discrepancies between the reported mechanism of injury and the clinical presentation are clearly outlined. I've handled suspected abuse cases before, Elaine explained. I know how important thorough documentation is for legal proceedings. In this case, it may be the difference between Richard Blackwood being held accountable or walking free, the detective said gravely. His attorney is already working to undermine the case, claiming the medical assessment was biased, that you led Tommy to make false statements. Anger flared in Elaine's chest. That's absurd. Tommy's physical injuries alone tell the story. The wrist fracture was days old, not hours as Richard claimed. The cigarette burns were in various stages of healing, indicating repeated, deliberate injury. The pattern of bruising on his back was consistent with belt marks, not a fall. I agree, Detective Foster assured her, and the evidence from the house strongly supports your assessment. But Richard Blackwood is wealthy, connected, and desperate. His attorney is already trying to suppress the evidence from the search, claiming procedural violations. What about the recordings? Elaine asked. Vivian mentioned he kept video of Tommy in the basement. A shadow crossed the detective's face. They're disturbing, to say the least, but also damning. If that evidence is admitted, it will be very difficult for Blackwood to maintain his innocence. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock. Mia opened the door, her expression urgent. Sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation, she said. Richard Blackwood's mother has arrived at the hospital, demanding to see Tommy. She's claiming grandparental rights and has brought her own attorney. Detective Foster stood immediately. Where are they now? Hospital administration is stalling them in the conference room, Mia explained. But they're being quite insistent. Mrs. Blackwood is claiming that Jessica is mentally unstable and that she, as Tommy's step-grandmother, should be given temporary custody. Elaine felt a chill. Another angle of attack, she murmured. If Richard can't get direct access, he'll try through his family. Exactly, Detective Foster agreed grimly. This is a coordinated legal strategy. Where are Jessica and Tommy now? Still in the room with the officer, Mia replied. Jessica is pretty shaken up. Apparently, Mrs. Blackwood has been trying to call her all morning, making threats and demands. I need to speak with hospital legal counsel, Detective Foster said, gathering her notes. We need to ensure the protective order extends to family members who might act as proxies for Richard. As the detective and Mia left to address this new challenge, Elaine returned to Tommy's room. She found Jessica pacing anxiously, while Tommy watched with wide, worried eyes. Elaine, Jessica said when she entered. Richard's mother is here. She's threatening to take Tommy, saying I'm an unfit mother. She's always hated me, always taken Richard's side no matter what he did. She's not going to take Tommy, Elaine assured her firmly. The protective order is in place, and Detective Foster is speaking with hospital legal counsel right now. You don't understand, Jessica insisted, her voice tight with fear. Vivian Blackwood is almost as dangerous as her son. She's the one who taught him how to manipulate people, how to maintain that perfect public image while being a monster in private. Tommy had drawn his knees up to his chest, his small face pinched with renewed anxiety. Elaine moved to his bedside, speaking gently but with conviction. "Tommy, I promised you that you would be safe here, and I meant it. No one is going to take you away from your mom. Not Richard, not his mother, not anyone." Tommy searched her face, looking for any sign of uncertainty. Finding none, he relaxed slightly, though his eyes still held a wariness that no 7-year-old should possess. "Can we go somewhere else?" he asked in a small voice. "I don't want to see her." The question broke Elaine's heart, but she understood his fear. "Let me find out what's happening," she promised. "I'll be right back." In the hallway, she found Mia returning from the conference with Detective Foster and hospital administrators. "What's the status?" Elaine asked immediately. "The hospital's legal counsel is clear that the protective order covers all visitation," Mia explained. "Mrs. Blackwood has no legal right to see Tommy without Jessica's consent, which obviously isn't forthcoming. Detective Foster is explaining the situation to her now." "How's she taking it?" Mia's expression was grim. "Not well. She's threatening lawsuits, claiming Jessica has poisoned Tommy against the entire Blackwood family. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It's illuminating to see where Richard learned his tactics. Tommy's asking if they can go somewhere else," Elaine said. "He's scared of seeing her, and frankly, I don't blame him." Mia nodded thoughtfully. "We were already discussing transfer to a more secure location. This might accelerate that timeline." She glanced at her watch. "Let me speak with Vivian Moore. CPS has safe houses specifically for situations like this, where a high-risk abuser has resources and connections that might compromise standard shelters." While Mia made her calls, Elaine returned to Tommy's room to update Jessica. The next few hours unfolded in a carefully orchestrated sequence. Hospital discharge papers were prepared, arrangements made with a specialized domestic violence shelter, and security measures enhanced. By evening, plans were in place for Tommy and Jessica to be transferred discreetly to a safe house outside the city. As they prepared for departure, Detective Foster arrived with news. "Richard Blackwood has been formally charged with multiple felonies," she informed them. "The district attorney is pushing for continued detention without bail, citing flight risk and the evidence of his plans to leave the country." Relief washed over Jessica's face. "So he'll stay in jail during the trial?" "That's our expectation," the detective confirmed. "The preliminary hearing is tomorrow morning. The evidence is substantial, including the recordings from your home." "Will we need to be there?" Jessica asked, glancing worriedly at Tommy, who was being entertained by a child life specialist while the adults spoke. "Not for the preliminary hearing," Detective Foster assured her. "Your safety is the priority right now. We'll keep you updated on the proceedings." As the time for transfer approached, Elaine found herself reluctant to say goodbye. In the span of 24 hours, Tommy and Jessica had gone from strangers to people she cared deeply about. Their journey was far from over. Legal battles loomed, healing would take time, and rebuilding their lives would require resources and support. But the first crucial step had been taken. Tommy had whispered his truth, and this time, someone had listened. "Will we see you again?" Tommy asked as the transport team arrived, his blue eyes solemn in his pale face. Elaine knelt to his level. "I'd like that very much, Tommy. And your mom has my number now. You can call me anytime. Okay?" Tommy nodded, then surprised her by stepping forward to wrap his good arm around her in a hug. "Thank you for believing me," he whispered. Elaine returned the embrace gently, careful of his injured wrist. "Always, Tommy. Always." As she watched them leave, escorted by security and social services staff, Elaine felt both hope and apprehension. The system was working for them now. Professionals engaged, resources allocated, protective measures in place. But she knew from experience that systems could fail, that the path to justice and healing was rarely straight or simple. "They'll be okay," Mia said, joining her as the elevator doors closed on Tommy and Jessica. The safe house is excellent, secure, supportive, with trauma-informed services for both of them. And when the media gets hold of this story? Elaine asked, aware that a case involving a prominent financial advisor like Richard Blackwood wouldn't stay quiet for long. When his attorney starts spinning narratives about Jessica's mental health or Tommy being manipulated, Mia sighed, acknowledging the challenges ahead. We fight back with truth, with evidence, with the systems designed to protect them. She paused, then added, and with people like you, who notice the signs and have the courage to act. As Elaine gathered her belongings to leave the hospital, exhaustion settled over her once more. The crisis had passed, at least for now, but the impact of the past 24 hours would linger. She knew from her brother's work how these cases typically unfolded. The legal battles, the attempts to discredit victims, the long journey toward healing and justice. But she also knew something else, that sometimes the simple act of believing a child could change everything. That whispered truths, when heard and honored, could break cycles of abuse that had seemed unbreakable. That systems, for all their flaws, could sometimes work as intended when the right people were engaged at the right moments. As she stepped out into the crisp October evening, Elaine thought of Tommy's blue eyes, of the fear that had given way to fragile hope, of the small hand that had reached for hers in trust. Whatever challenges lay ahead for him and Jessica, that moment of connection, of one human being truly seeing another's pain and responding with care, would remain a foundation upon which healing could be built. And in the quiet of her car, before starting the drive home, Elaine allowed herself a moment of gratitude for the privilege of being that foundation, for the sacred responsibility of bearing witness to a child's truth, and for the profound reminder that sometimes the most important thing any of us can do is simply listen. 6 months later, the April sunshine poured through the windows of Elaine's small bungalow, warming the living room where Tommy Mills sat cross-legged on the floor, focused intently on the jigsaw puzzle before him. At 7.5, he still carried the shadows of his experiences in his watchful blue eyes, but those eyes now sparked with life and occasional mischief, glimpses of the carefree child emerging from beneath layers of trauma. I found another edge piece, he announced triumphantly, fitting it into place with his nimble fingers. The cast on his wrist had come off months ago, leaving only the faintest scar as physical evidence of that fateful night in October. Good job, Elaine praised, bringing a tray of lemonade and cookies from the kitchen. Her Sunday afternoon visits with Tommy and Jessica had become a ritual over the months, a constant in their lives as they navigated the turbulent waters of recovery, legal proceedings, and rebuilding. Jessica looked up from the stack of papers she'd been reviewing at the dining table. At 34, she had undergone a transformation that was both subtle and profound. The haunted, hollow-eyed woman from the emergency room had given way to someone who stood straighter, spoke more confidently, and smiled more readily. Her blonde hair, once limp with stress, now fell in healthy waves around a face that had regained its color. Almost finished with these forms, she said, signing the last page with a flourish. Mary thinks everything should be finalized by the end of the month. Mary Lawson, Jessica's attorney from the Domestic Violence Legal Advocacy Center, had become another pillar in their support system. Through her tireless efforts, the divorce from Richard had proceeded despite his attempts to delay and obstruct. The protective order had been extended indefinitely, and most critically, Jessica had been awarded full custody of Tommy with no visitation rights for Richard. Then it's really happening? Elaine asked, setting the tray down on the coffee table. Vermont next month? Jessica nodded, a mixture of excitement and apprehension crossing her features. Diane says the teaching position is mine if I want it. First grade, starting with the new school year in September. She glanced at Tommy, lowering her voice slightly. And the therapist there comes highly recommended. She specializes in childhood trauma. Elaine smiled, genuinely happy for them but already feeling the bittersweetness of their impending departure. They had become important fixtures in her life, their weekly visits, the gradual witnessing of their healing, the quiet joy of seeing Tommy emerge from his shell one small moment at a time. Vermont is beautiful, she said, joining Tommy on the floor. And you'll be near your aunt, right? Aunt Kate, Tommy confirmed, reaching for a cookie. She has horses. This fact, mentioned at least once during every visit, clearly ranked high in Tommy's assessment of their new home's merits. And she has that guest room with the telescope, Jessica added, joining them in the living room. Remember how you could see the mountains from the window when we visited at Christmas? Tommy nodded enthusiastically. Mom says maybe I can take astronomy in school next year. If I want. The small phrase, if I want, represented enormous progress. Under Richard's regime, Tommy had never been allowed preferences or choices. Now, decision-making had become a carefully nurtured skill in his ongoing recovery. You'd be great at astronomy, Elaine said. You've got such a good eye for details. She gestured to the puzzle, which was taking shape under his methodical approach. As they enjoyed their lemonade and cookies, the conversation flowed easily between serious matters and lighthearted ones. Tommy described his latest art therapy session, proudly explaining how he'd created a feelings map of safe and unsafe places. Jessica shared updates on the legal proceedings. Richard's trial was set for June, though a plea deal seemed increasingly likely given the overwhelming evidence against him. His mother finally stopped trying to contact us, Jessica mentioned, a weight lifting from her voice. The cease and desist letter from Mary seems to have worked. Vivian Blackwood had proven almost as persistent as her son, attempting multiple times to circumvent the protective order through intermediaries and legal maneuvers. Like Richard, she had underestimated the resources now arrayed to protect Tommy and Jessica. A coordinated network of legal advocates, social services professionals, and law enforcement. How is Tommy doing with all of this? Elaine asked quietly during a moment when he had gone to the bathroom. Jessica's expression softened. Better, overall. The nightmares are less frequent now, maybe once a week instead of every night. He still gets anxious in confined spaces, and loud voices can trigger him. She sighed. His therapist says it's a long road, but he's making remarkable progress. Children are resilient, especially when they feel safe. And you? Elaine asked, noticing the shadows under Jessica's eyes despite her improved demeanor. One day at a time, Jessica admitted. The divorce proceedings are draining, even with Mary handling most of it. Richard's still trying to claim mental instability on my part, still trying to paint himself as the victim. She shook her head. But the evidence is too strong. Even his high-priced attorneys can't explain away those recordings. The videos recovered from the Blackwood home had proven devastating to Richard's defense. Methodical documentation of his abuse that had sickened even veteran law enforcement officers. The journal detailing his disciplinary methods had been equally damning, revealing a coldly calculated approach to breaking a child's spirit. Tommy returned from the bathroom and settled back at his puzzle, humming softly to himself. Another new behavior that signaled his growing comfort and security. Oh, I almost forgot, Jessica said, reaching for her bag. Tommy has something for you. Tommy looked up, his expression brightening. My project. He scrambled to his feet and took a large envelope from his mother, presenting it to Elaine with a mixture of pride and shyness. I made it in art therapy. It's for you. Elaine accepted the envelope, touched by the gesture. Inside was a carefully crafted card, decorated with colorful drawings and cut-out shapes. On the front, rendered in a 7-year-old's earnest hand, were the words, "Thank you for listening." Inside, Tommy had written a short message. Dear Nurse Winters, thank you for believing me when I was scared. You are my hero. Love. Tommy. Beneath the message was a drawing of two figures. A small boy with a blue cast and a woman in scrubs, standing hand in hand before what appeared to be a hospital. Emotion welled in Elaine's throat as she studied the heartfelt creation. Tommy, this is beautiful. Thank you so much. Tommy beamed, pleased by her reaction. Ms. Gabrielle, that's my art therapist, said making thank you cards is a good way to tell people they're important to you. Well, you're very important to me too, Elaine said, carefully setting the card on her mantelpiece where it would be displayed prominently. The afternoon continued with a walk to the nearby park, where Tommy tested his growing confidence on the playground equipment. Elaine and Jessica sat on a bench nearby, watching as he navigated the social dynamics of playing alongside other children. Another skill he was gradually recovering after years of isolation. "I can't believe how far he's come," Jessica said softly, observing as Tommy cautiously joined a game of tag. 6 months ago, he could barely speak above a whisper. Now look at him. "Children heal when they're given the space and support to do so," Elaine replied, echoing something her brother often said about his young clients. "And you've given him both." Jessica shook her head slightly. "We wouldn't have had the chance without you, Elaine. If you hadn't noticed the inconsistencies that night, if you hadn't created an opportunity to speak with Tommy alone," she trailed off, the alternative too painful to articulate. "You would have found a way out eventually," Elaine assured her. "You were already looking for opportunities, already trying to protect Tommy." "Maybe," Jessica conceded. "But who knows how much more he would have suffered before that happened. How much more I would have endured, believing I had no options." She turned to face Elaine directly. "You changed our lives that night, not just by stopping Richard when he came back with the gun, but by seeing what others had missed. By believing a little boy's whisper when everyone else accepted the story they were told." Elaine felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest. Not pride, exactly, but gratitude for having been in the right place at the right time, with the right training and instincts to make a difference. "It's why I became a nurse," she said simply. "To help people when they're most vulnerable." They watched Tommy for a while longer, his laughter carrying across the playground as he grew more comfortable with the game. The sound was precious, a reminder of childhood's resilience and the healing power of safety. "We'll stay in touch from Vermont," Jessica promised as they gathered their things to head back to Elaine's house. "Weekend visits might be harder, but we could FaceTime regularly. And maybe you could visit us sometime? Diane's guest house has plenty of room." "I'd like that," Elaine said sincerely. "Very much." As they walked back through the neighborhood, Tommy's energy seemed inexhaustible. He skipped ahead, stopping to examine interesting rocks or pick dandelions that had pushed through the spring soil. His curiosity, so long suppressed by fear, now emerged in a constant stream of observations and questions. "Look, a robin," he called, pointing to a bird pulling a worm from a neighbor's lawn. "Did you know they can hear worms moving underground? That's how they find them." Jessica and Elaine exchanged smiles at his enthusiasm. Another sign of his healing, this ability to find wonder in ordinary things. Back at Elaine's house, the afternoon light had begun to soften, signaling that their visit would soon end. Tommy returned to his puzzle, determined to complete it before they left. Jessica gathered their belongings, organizing the various papers and resources she'd accumulated during their monthly meeting with the domestic violence support team. "The advocate says we should be prepared for Richard to continue legal challenges even after the divorce is finalized," she mentioned, sorting documents into folders. "He's apparently telling people he'll never stop fighting for his family." Elaine felt a chill at the words, recognizing the thinly veiled threat beneath the seemingly benign statement. "Mary has connections in Vermont, right? People who can help ensure the protective order is enforced across state lines." Jessica nodded. "She's already coordinated with an advocacy group there. The school administration has been briefed, and the local police have his photo. All the safeguards we can put in place we have." She sighed, a flash of the old fear crossing her features. "But sometimes I still wake up at night, certain he's found us." "That's normal," Elaine assured her. "Trauma doesn't disappear overnight, but you're doing everything right. Protecting Tommy, getting support for yourself, building a new life." Jessica's phone chimed with a text message. "That's our ride," she said, checking the screen. "The support group carpool." Tommy looked up from his nearly completed puzzle. "But I'm not finished yet," he protested, disappointment evident in his voice. "Tell you what," Elaine suggested. "Why don't you finish it here, and I'll frame it for you? It can be waiting in your new room in Vermont when you move." Tommy's face brightened at the suggestion. "Really? You'd do that?" "Of course," Elaine promised. It's a beautiful puzzle. It deserves to be displayed. Satisfied with this plan, Tommy carefully transferred the unfinished puzzle to a cardboard backing that Elaine provided, ensuring no pieces would be lost. As Jessica helped him into his jacket, he turned to Elaine with unexpected solemnity. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper reminiscent of that first night. "Of course, Tommy. Anything. Are you going to be okay when we move away?" The question revealed a depth of empathy that many adults never achieved. Concern for someone else's feelings even amid his own significant transitions. Touched by his thoughtfulness, Elaine knelt to meet his eye level, a position that had become natural in their interactions. "I'll miss you both very much," she said honestly. "But knowing that you're safe and happy in Vermont will make me happy too. And we'll stay in touch, just like your mom said." Tommy considered this, then nodded, apparently satisfied. "And you'll come visit the horses?" "I wouldn't miss it," Elaine promised. As they prepared to leave, Tommy suddenly stepped forward and wrapped his arms around Elaine in a fierce hug. "Thank you," he whispered in her ear, echoing the message from his card. "For listening." The simple phrase held volumes. Gratitude for that crucial moment in the emergency room, for the ongoing support, for being a steady presence during the most turbulent time in his young life. Elaine returned the embrace, careful not to hold too tightly, respecting the boundaries that were an important part of Tommy's healing. "Always," she whispered back. "Always." Jessica's eyes glistened as she watched the exchange, her own emotions close to the surface. When Tommy stepped back, she moved forward to embrace Elaine as well. "I don't know how to thank you enough," she said softly. "Live your best life," Elaine replied simply. "Both of you. That's all the thanks I need." From the window, Elaine watched as they walked to the waiting car, Tommy chattering animatedly about something that made Jessica laugh. The afternoon sun caught in their matching blonde hair, creating momentary halos around their heads. They looked, in that instant, like any ordinary mother and son heading home after a pleasant visit. Not survivors of years of calculated cruelty, not witnesses in an ongoing criminal case, just two people moving forward together into a future that held genuine promise. Elaine's gaze fell on Tommy's card, now displayed prominently on her mantelpiece. "Thank you for listening." Such a simple act, listening, yet one that had changed the trajectory of 3 lives irrevocably. In her 15 years as an ER nurse, Elaine had learned that sometimes the most important medical intervention wasn't a procedure or medication, but the willingness to hear what wasn't being said, to notice what others missed, to create space for truth to emerge. As the car carrying Tommy and Jessica disappeared around the corner, Elaine felt not sadness but a profound sense of rightness. Their journey toward healing would continue in Vermont, with new challenges and triumphs that she would witness from a distance. Her own life would continue here in Boston, where other patients would need her training, her compassion, her willingness to listen. That night, as she prepared for her next shift at Mercy General, Elaine thought about the emergency department where it had all begun. The sterile examination bay where a small boy had found the courage to whisper his truth. The fluorescent-lit corridor where a desperate man had made his final attempt at control. The quiet pediatric room where healing had taken its first tentative root. Hospitals were transitory spaces by nature, places where people passed through during crisis, rarely staying long enough to witness the full arc of recovery. Yet sometimes, if you were fortunate, you caught glimpses of the lives you touched unfolding beyond those institutional walls. Tommy and Jessica were such a glimpse for Elaine, a reminder that even in the most broken systems, individual actions could create openings for transformation. As she pinned her badge to her scrubs and checked her equipment one last time, Elaine felt a renewed sense of purpose. Tonight there would be other patients, other challenges, other opportunities to notice what others might miss. And somewhere in Vermont, a small boy with haunting blue eyes and his resilient mother were packing for a new beginning. Alive, healing, and free because someone had taken the time to listen to a whispered truth. For Elaine Winters, veteran ER nurse who had seen humanity at its most vulnerable and its most cruel, that knowledge was enough. More than enough. It was everything.